In this video, we'll focus on market equilibrium. Market equilibrium takes into account the relationship between demand and supply. But before we get into how the market equilibrium graph is drawn or shown, let's do a quick recap on the demand curve and the supply curve. Let's recall that when we have a demand curve, when prices increase, we know that quantity demanded or consumption decreases. And when prices decrease, quantity demanded increases or consumption also increases. This follows the law of demand, which shows that there's a negative relationship between prices and quantity demanded. We also know that the only thing that causes a move along the curve is when prices increase or decrease. For example, if prices were to increase from P0 to P1, quantity demanded would drop. So if we show this increase from P0 to P1, quantity demanded will decrease from Q0 to Q1, causing a move along from point A to point B. We then understood what causes a shift in the demand curve. The demand curve either shifts to the right or to the left-hand side. For example, if the demand curve would shift to the right-hand side, showing an increase in demand, we know that D0 will shift all the way to D1, keeping price constant and just increasing our quantity demanded. So we have a shift from point A to point B, and these are caused by the 5 determinants of demand which are listed below. The difference between a move along and a shift is that external factors shift your demand curve, whereas price is the only variable that causes a move along in the curve. Don't forget the last one, which is listed here, number 5, is shown in a separate video called cross-price elasticity. Moving on to the supply curve, we know that when prices increase, then quantity supplied increases because suppliers are getting paid a higher price for their product. And when prices decrease, quantity supplied decreases, which means that because they're receiving less for their production, they will supply the market with less goods. Just as we saw in how the demand curve moves along the curve, the same thing happens with the supply curve. When prices increase from P0 to P1, this shows that there's an increase in quantity supplied from Q0 to Q1. Therefore, the movement from A to point B is shown here. So we have a move along the curve, and here again, the only thing that causes a move along is a change in the price. On the other hand, we also know that the supply curve shifts to the right and to the left. For example, if supply was to shift to the right-hand side from S0 to S1, we'll know that the price here will also stay the same because the shift in the supply curve to the right-hand side does not depend on the price increasing or decreasing. Increasing quantity from Q0 to Q1, showing a shift of the curve from point A to point B. And what causes these shifts are all of these determinants of supply, which are shown here at the bottom. Now that we understand how the supply and demand curves are derived, we can show this on a curve where price is equal to quantity supplied. So here, for example, we have P0 is equal to quantity 0 at the equilibrium point E. Let's assume that the price of the product is 20 Rand and the quantity consumed in units is 20 as well. How do we get to an equilibrium point E? So for example, let's start off with the demand curve, which is the blue curve, and let's see what consumers are willing to pay for the product. Consumers are willing to pay an amount of 30 Rand for that particular product, and suppliers, the green curve, they're willing to supply the product at 10 Rand. But suppliers soon realize they could probably charge a higher price. That's at 20 Rand. So for example, when the price increases for that product, quantity supplied also increases, and that would lead us to point E. The same thing happens with consumers, that as supply increases, the price of that particular product decreases, so they also score an extra 10 Rand. So they now pay 20 Rand instead of 30 Rand. So what we can say is that when a supplier charges a higher price of 20 Rand, he scores an extra 10 Rand, and it's shown in this triangle here. So this triangle here would show something that we call producer surplus. And the consumer also scores an extra 10 Rand by only paying 20 Rand. So he scores this triangle over here, which is called now your consumer surplus. These are two important concepts in economics where it shows that where demand is exactly equal to supply at P0 and Q0.